Welcome to the deep dive, right? We get you up to speed on really complex topics, but in a fun way. We don't want to bore you with reports and things like that. So you're here to understand the world better, and so are we. Today, we are diving into a super intricate story, the history, and the present too, of the Christian witness in China.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating story, isn't it? And luckily for us, we have a pretty solid force to help guide our deep dive, which is Christian Witness to the Chinese People by Thomas Wang and Sharon Chan. And it's worth noting right off the bat that their credentials are super impressive. I mean, Thomas Wang is President Emeritus of the Great Commission Center International and has had all kinds of leadership positions in organizations like the 82,000 and Beyond movement and the Lausanne Committee for World Evangelization. Sharon Chan, she's the current president of the Great Commission Center. So their experience really gives us a valuable lens. We can look through that lens to try and understand this really long history.
Absolutely. I mean, the goal of this whole deep dive is to understand the entire journey of Christianity in China. We want to explore where it began, the massive roadblocks that popped up along the way, and the amazing growth that it's experienced, and ultimately what the future might hold. So to get started, we need to step back and acknowledge just the massive scale and historical weight of China itself. I mean, we're talking about a country with over 1/5 of all humanity. That's 1.3 billion people, with a continuous and resilient culture that goes back 5,000 years. Just imagine that for a second, an unbroken line of history for 5,000 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's truly mind-boggling. Yeah. And it's a civilization that has experienced so many things, right? Countless internal struggles, external pressures. And yet it's maintained its unique identity. And it's not just one uniform group. While the majority, 93%, are Han Chinese, there are at least 55 officially recognized minority groups. You know, they're primarily located in the border regions, and they have their own distinct traditions and cultures. And what's really interesting is the language situation. Like those minority groups, they speak 78 languages other than Mandarin.
Wow.
And even within the Han Chinese population, you've got hundreds of dialects. And the authors say some of them are as different from each other as German is from French.
Yeah.
So you can imagine, with Mandarin as the official language, it adds a whole nother level of complexity to communicating and connecting.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we've got this huge, historically deep, super diverse population. And for most of China's history, as Wang and Chan write in the book, the triune God of the Bible has been almost a stranger. But it's not like there were no people who knew God, right? We're talking way back. Jewish synagogues and Nestorian Christian communities. And they were merchants, right? So they were part of these networks during the Tang Dynasty. And we need to remember that during the Tang Dynasty, Chinese civilization was in many ways more advanced than Europe. And then later you had the Franciscan missionaries that came during the time of the Mongol rule. And then there were those resourceful Jesuits that came in the 16th and 17th centuries.
And they did a lot. But, as the authors point out, these periods were pretty short-lived. And for different reasons, they didn't have much of a lasting spiritual benefit for the common people. They had some impact, but it was limited. It didn't really reach the majority of people.
Right. So that brings us to a point where things actually start to change. And that's when the Christian church is actually established among millions of people in China. And that didn't really happen until the 19th and 20th centuries. And that's when we see the arrival of both Catholic and Protestant missions. But even during this period, even when things are really starting to change, there were some really serious problems. The book talks about how the church was often seen as connected to Western culture and influence, rather than being something that the Chinese people embraced naturally.
And that perception led to some serious challenges. I mean, towards the end of the 19th century, the church faced more and more suspicion from the authorities in China. And they kind of link it with Western imperialism, given the history of colonialism and all that. And unfortunately, this suspicion reached its peak during the Boxer Uprising in 1900. And this was tragic, but in a way, it also started to plant the seeds for indigenous church leadership, because foreign missionaries started facing real danger.
Yeah, that was a horrible event. We're talking about nearly 200 missionaries and over 2,000 Chinese Christians in North China who were martyred.
Right.
It's really a reminder of how difficult things were at the beginning and the huge sacrifices that were made during those early years.
And the pressure didn't let up. In March 1922, there was this whole anti-Christian movement, and they targeted the World Student Christian Federation's International Conference. And that was supposed to be held at Tsinghua University. And they basically labeled Christianity as the, cultural arm of Western imperialism. And so the Chinese church came under attack again.
So what happened after all this opposition? What was the result?
Well, something pretty amazing happened. The Chinese churches started to separate from foreign missions, and they started to establish their own independent churches. So this is the beginning of the Chinese indigenous church movement.
It was a big turning point.
It was. Yeah, and this shift toward independence actually happened at the same time as a period of significant growth. Between 1927 and 1937, there was what they call the Great Revival within the church in China.
Yeah.
And during this time, some really strong, capable Chinese leaders emerged. And the authors say this was so important for preparing the church for the challenges that were coming after 1949.
Yeah. And, thinking about that period of indigenous leadership, it seems like it was so crucial. Do the authors talk about any specific individuals or events that really fueled that growth during that time?
Yeah, they do. They highlight the rise of some really influential pastors and evangelists,
Yeah.
people who were Chinese, right?
Mhm.
And they were able to really connect with the local culture, sometimes in ways that foreign missionaries just couldn't.
Yeah.
So this move towards having, Chinese leaders was really important for the impact of the revival.
1949, huge turning point, right? The Communist Revolution. And the church entered a period that Wang and Chan describe as like painful convulsions under revolutionary fervor. And it's interesting, almost like it was planned, by 1951, almost all Western missionaries had been forced to leave China.
Yeah, a real turning point. The new government wanted to cut all ties between the Chinese church and the West, and they wanted to bring the church under the control of the state. And this is what led to the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, the TSPM. And they said their goal was to liberate the church from the control of Western imperialism.
Right.
But the government, they didn't just want administrative control. They also wanted to kind of promote their own version of Christianity that lined up with socialist principles. And that created real conflict.
And the impact was really intense. I mean, churches were forced to merge. Even churches from different denominations in the same city, many Christians suffered a lot. And some were imprisoned and even killed for their faith. Then came the Cultural Revolution, right? That was 1966 to 1976, a really horrible period when all public church activities were banned, Bibles were confiscated. It's hard to even imagine.
It's hard to imagine. But even in those incredibly tough times, the faith of the believers didn't die out. The authors emphasize that a lot of Christians continue to worship and have fellowship in secret, right, in their own homes. It's really powerful, That kind of resilience, even when facing such extreme adversity.
It is. It really is. So after Mao Zedong died and Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, things began to change gradually. The bamboo curtain started to lift. And here's where the story takes a really interesting turn. See, for about 30 years, from 49 to 79, the outside world didn't really know what was happening with Christianity in China. Like, no one knew for sure. There were questions about whether all that missionary work had been for nothing.
Big questions.
Yeah.
And the answer was amazing when it finally came out. In 1979, China began to normalize relations with the U.S., and they allowed more visitors in. And what those visitors found was a living, growing church with tons of Christians openly proclaiming Jesus as Lord.
Wow.
The numbers are really surprising. I mean, Jonathan Chow, he estimated that the Christian population grew from about 840,000 in 1949 to something like 35 million by 1982.
Wow.
That's huge growth. And it wasn't just a number, It showed that all those years of trying to suppress the faith, it didn't work. Faith is powerful.
It really is a real aha moment. It shows how the Spirit was working during those difficult years, even when no one could see it.
Yeah.
So then in March 1979, the Chinese Communist Party started to reinstate its religious policy. The TSPM came back in August that year, and churches were slowly allowed to reopen, but under their control and supervision. And at first, this was mostly in big cities, and it was mostly for foreigners. But eventually, Chinese citizens were allowed to attend these official churches.
Yeah. So between 1979 and 1998, the church in China basically existed in two separate spheres.
Right.
First, you had the official churches registered with the TSPM and the China Christian Council, the CCC. These were the open churches.
Right.
And then there was this much larger network of house churches that were kind of operating under the radar.
So the registered churches, they met in specific places, buildings that were around before 1949 or ones that were built after that, and they had to follow all these government regulations. And they were under the control of the Communist Party and the TSPM. This meant that they had some limitations, right? Like only approved pastors could lead. They couldn't just meet anywhere. And they weren't allowed to do any organized evangelism outside of the church itself. But even with all that, by 1997, these registered churches were a pretty big presence. They had over 12,000 churches, and 25,000 meeting points with over 13 million Protestant Chinese Christians.
Wow.
That's a lot.
Yeah. But then, on the other hand, you had the house churches, right? And they had a much larger following, they think. It's like 70 to 80 million believers. And they mostly met in private homes, except in the Wenzhou region.
Right.
They had some actual church buildings there. And the authors call these house churches the mainstream ecclesiastical reality in China. But it's really important to remember, right? They weren't officially recognized by the government. And they face all sorts of pressure and sometimes even persecution.
Now let's shift gears a little and talk about something else. Since 1949, there's been a really significant global Chinese diaspora, about 57 million overseas Chinese people, including 21 million in Taiwan, spread across over 60 countries. And what's interesting is, where they ended up. Many of them are in leadership positions, in academics, in professional fields, in business.
Yeah.
For example, in North America, a lot of them are professionals. And in Southeast Asia, a lot of them have important business roles.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that this diaspora, this global Chinese community, they've shown a real openness to Christianity.
Right.
By 1998, there were at least 8,000 Chinese churches established in over 50 countries.
Right.
And there was this survey by the Los Angeles Times back in 1997, and it found that 32% of Chinese residents in Southern California regularly attended church.
Really?
Yeah. And among the evangelical Christians in the diaspora, there's this strong sense that they have a significant role to play in God's kingdom.
Yeah.
Especially in sharing their faith with their homeland.
Yeah.
It's a really compelling picture of how the global church is taking shape.
It is. It really is. But let's go back to China and talk about the official religious policy there. Wang and Chan make it clear that the government has a lot of control over all religious activities. So all Christian groups have to register with the government. They have to accept the leadership of the TSPM, and they have to follow the government's rules about religion. So only the 3 self-churches and their meeting points are considered legal, and the government sees them as the only true representatives of Protestantism in China. And the experts agree the main goal of these laws is to control and limit the growth of Christianity.
Yeah. And because of that, any house churches that decide not to register, they're seen with a lot of suspicion.
Right.
And they might face suppression. The government often sees them as illegal, and their activities could be punished. But even with all that pressure, most house churches haven't registered.
Yeah.
They want to keep their beliefs pure, choose their own leaders, evangelize according to the scripture, and run their churches without interference. It's a matter of principle.
But there's this really interesting thing that happened in the 1990s. Some official leaders started to show an interest in Christianity.
Oh, interesting.
Not necessarily a personal conversion, but like a scholarly interest.
Yeah.
Like they wanted to study it academically. And universities and publishers started to publish all these books and papers about Christianity, its history, its influence on China.
Wow.
And then, in early 1998, they established a Christianity Research Center under the Chinese Academy of Social Science. A pretty big deal.
A big deal.
Yeah.
What's fascinating is that many of the researchers at this new center, most of them weren't Christians. They were actually sent overseas to study at theological seminaries.
Really?
Yeah. They received proper theological training, learned how churches function in different parts of the world, and many people believe that these scholars would become leaders in the Religious Affairs Bureau and the TSPM, maybe even teach in seminaries, pastor churches, and help shape future religious policy. It suggests that maybe there was a more strategic approach to engaging with Christianity within the government, at least in some parts of it.
Despite all this, Wang and Chan highlight that since 1989, there's been a pretty noticeable increase in the number of believers and people who are active in both the official churches and the unregistered house churches.
Wow.
And this growth continued even after Tiananmen Square.
Yeah.
So it's pretty remarkable. The Christian faith in China is really resilient.
And it wasn't just the general population that was changing. Chinese intellectuals, they had become disillusioned with the Communist Party because they hadn't delivered on promised political reforms. So they started searching for other ideologies, other sources of meaning.
Right.
And Christianity, with its focus on individual conscience and transcendent values, it became an attractive option. People started to see it differently.
Yeah.
It wasn't just for the elderly and uneducated anymore.
Yeah.
And we even saw Bible study groups forming on university campuses, which is really encouraging.
And despite pressure to register, the house church movement kept growing.
Right.
The authors talk about non-registered meeting points in almost every village north of the Yangtze River. Some villages even became majority Christian. The majority of the people living there were Christians.
So that's amazing. And over time, those house churches started to become more organized. They weren't just informal groups anymore. They developed into larger groups, almost like denominations in the West. They had structures at the county, prefecture, provincial, even national levels, so they could provide oversight and coordinate activities.
And there's another really interesting thing here. Wang and Chan point out that some leaders in the official rural churches, they've become more evangelical in their beliefs. And they've even shown sympathy and friendship towards the house churches. There are even cases of cooperation between leaders from both sides in conducting training programs within the official churches.
Oh, wow, that's great.
Yeah, it shows that there's a sense of shared purpose at a grassroots level. But with all this growth, there are real needs. Both the official and the house churches need more trained pastors, more full-time ministry workers, and more Christian literature. The official churches have seminaries and Bible schools. The house churches have short-term training seminars.
Yeah.
But the demand is just huge. There's also a big need for Bibles, commentaries, and other resources. Now let's talk about missions to China. Wang and Chan stress that China has been a mission field for a long time, but Christianity has often been seen as a cultural invasion and enemy by the government and some parts of society.
Right.
So anyone doing mission work in China today needs to be aware of that history and the current situation.
Definitely. And the authors talk about two main types of mission work: primary or direct mission, which focuses on evangelism and equipping local churches and Christians for outreach, and secondary or indirect mission, which aims to create a more welcoming environment for Christianity and address the official stance towards it.
Right.
Within these two categories, they outline three different approaches. The first one is what they call incarnational servanthood. And because there's that sensitivity around Western influence, this approach tries to operate outside of traditional church structures. It's about placing mature Christian professionals and business people in China, people who can make a difference in their fields.
So they can build relationships with their Chinese counterparts, even government officials. The hope is that this will slowly build trust and change perceptions of Christianity among those who have influence.
Yeah.
This incarnational servanthood can take different forms. It could be engaging in academia, with Christian professionals teaching in universities, doing research, or teaching languages. It could also be strategic business investments, contributing to real estate, manufacturing, tourism, consulting. Or it could be community development projects, focusing on the needs of minority groups in remote areas, providing medical services, education, agricultural help.
The second approach is the official church approach. After Deng Xiaoping's reforms and the opening up of China, there's been more cross-cultural exchange between three self-churches and churches in other parts of the world.
Right.
And this approach is often used by church leaders in the West who might not have connections with the house churches. Even churches in Hong Kong have become more involved since the handover.
Yeah. The main goal here is to strengthen the official church within the legal limits and hope that the genuine witness of Christians from other countries can influence even the nominal believers within these structures. So things like guest preaching in official churches and teaching in their seminaries and Bible colleges.
The third approach is the house church approach. And in recent years, this has become a major focus for missions, especially among overseas Chinese churches. They see that the house churches are independent from the government and that there are so many of them, like 85% of Chinese Christians, that they feel it's important to work with them directly.
Right.
And even though house church Christians often face persecution, many Chinese Christian leaders believe that this persecution has actually made the church stronger.
Yeah.
Ministries that focus on supporting house churches have to be discreet because of the restrictions. And the biggest needs here aren't traditional missionary activities. It's more about providing in-depth Bible teaching, helping them understand doctrine, and guarding against heresies. It's also about training leaders and providing Bibles and commentaries carefully so they don't become dependent.
It's important to say that Wang and Chan see all three of these approaches as valid ways to do mission work in China.
Right.
They warn against creating new ministries that might actually harm existing ones.
Right.
And they emphasize that it's important to serve with humility and to learn from the experiences of Chinese Christians.
Yeah, and they highlight this amazing opportunity with Chinese scholars outside of China. Since 1980, hundreds of thousands of Chinese scholars have gone to study in universities all over the world, and the authors see this as a great opportunity for sharing the gospel and making disciples. Lots of churches and organizations are reaching out to these scholars, offering friendship, help with adjusting to new cultures, and introducing them to Christianity. And they estimate that at least 10% of Chinese scholars in North America have become Christians.
Wow.
Some even feel called to ministry. So they have the potential to make a big impact when they go back to China.
So let's look ahead to the future. Wang and Chan talk about China in the 21st century, and they talk about the predictions of huge economic growth, maybe even rivaling the United States.
Right.
This raises big questions about China's future role in the world. Will it be a positive force or a negative force? It emphasizes how important evangelism is, since only about 7% of the population is Christian right now.
Right.
And they even mention that there are whole Christian villages in some areas. They even ask if China could one day become a Christian nation.
Wow.
Imagine the possibilities, right? And the impact it could have on the world if half or more of China's population was Christian.
It's hard to even imagine.
So when thinking about mission strategy today, they point out that there are major economic differences within China. The coastal areas are doing much better than the poorer, more remote inland areas, especially those where minority groups live.
Right. Those are the areas that need the most help. They also talk about how the government is trying to reduce the rural population, which means more people are moving to the cities. So there are a lot of urban challenges that need to be addressed.
Yeah. And on a more positive note, Wang and Chan suggest that as China's economy keeps changing, it might lead to more freedom for its people and more chances to interact with the outside world.
Yeah.
These shifts could create space for more diverse thinking and maybe even more religious freedom in the future.
That would be amazing.
Right. And they stress that we need to be prepared for a time when China might relax its restrictions on religion, and it could become both a receiver and a sender of missionaries.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that Christianity has been trying to establish itself in China for centuries. And today, we have a real opportunity to learn from the past, both the good and the bad.
Right.
And we can hope for wisdom and discernment for everyone serving in China, that they can do so with love, patience, and humility. Absolutely. And as Wang and Chan conclude, this huge task of sharing the Christian message with almost a quarter of humanity will require a global effort. We need to use all the different approaches and partnerships we've talked about.
So one final thought for you as you think about all this. Given the incredible growth of the Chinese church, even with all the pressure and restrictions, what could happen if those restrictions were lifted? What would be the global impact on the spread of Christianity and on China's role in the world in the 21st century?
Yeah.
It's a really important question that deserves a lot of thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.